Carmen, Justin, Mari, and everybody from the Mapping Festival for this invitation. So my name is Daphne Dragona. I'm a curator and a writer. I am based in Berlin and I'm working at Transmediale Festival. I'll be introducing and moderating this session. A session where we're going to talk about the future, and more specifically in a way about the way we talk about the future, about the types of narratives and images that influence our understanding of it. I think it's it's very interesting that we tend to say that the future today feels closer than ever, that it feels like it has merged with the present and that we are already experiencing tomorrow's worlds. And some common and different references here would be, for instance, the increasing use of AI systems in different sectors of life, the effects of climate change that we're already feeling, but also the emergence of new artificial ecologies that are promising answers to the problems that humanity is facing. So our understanding of the future is based on different phenomena and aspects, and respectively, it is charged with fear, denial, or hope and positivism, depending on different beliefs, ideologies, and also interests. And we should also remember that it's not only, of course, about environmental and technological futures, but also about social and political ones that we have ahead of us. So the question is, given this complexity, how can we address the changes that are already taking place, and which are the practices and tools that we have at hand? And what we wish to discuss in the context of this panel is specifically the role of dystopias and utopias that are referring to what is yet to come. An example of them, of course, we can find in sci-fi novels, films, TV series, but also in artistic, architectural, and design projects. And this is nothing new. There is quite a tradition already. But studying them and looking into them within this specific era that we're in might shed still light to what is at stake and what it is that we're not discussing. So what we need to reflect more upon, for instance, is who are the actors, the authors, the creators that are visualizing the future, and whom do they mostly address, which stories are told and which stories are not being told, which futures are near and for whom, and how possible is it at the end to evoke change? Do we rather need to turn more towards more realistic approaches? So this is, in a way, let's say, the territory. These are some starting points in this session that I think we will go beyond the strict constraints of what art and design can offer in the shaping of the futures, and rather move towards the direction of the open questions of agency, of empowerment, and of collective action. So to dive into these topics, we have with us two artists with significant work, artistic work, recent research and writing, Julian and Tobias Revell. I'll just say a few words about them now. Julian is a New Zealander, critical engineer, artist and activist based in Berlin. He has been actively exhibiting and lecturing worldwide since 1996. His projects and papers have been presented at many museums, international electronic art events, and conferences, including the Tate Modern, Transmediale, Ars Electronica, File Festival, and the Japan Media Arts Festival. Julian's work has received several awards, most notably a Golden Nika at Prise Ars Electronica in 2011 for the project Newsweek, developed together with Danya Vasiliev. Tobias is a course leader of MA Interaction Design Communication at the London the London College of Communication, UAL. He's a co-founder of research consultancy Strange Telemetry, and together with Natalie Kane, Tobias has launched the research and curatorial project Haunted Machines, and together they curated the Impact Festival last fall. He lectures and exhibits internationally, and has recently appeared at Improving Reality, Future Everything, Impact, Web Direction Sydney, Transmediale, ThingsCon, and Lift in Geneva. He's also a PhD candidate in design at Goldsmiths. So we will start with brief talks of around 15 minutes, then we will move on to the discussion, and of course Q&A will also follow. Thank you. Please welcome Julian after Tobias.
Hi everyone, one moment. Just put this guy in. I think it'll be all right. No, I don't need sound yet. It's all good. Thanks, mate. Okay. Okay, so first of all, I'm very, very grateful to have the opportunity to speak here within this frame. This is, in fact, the first talk I will have given in about 10 years that doesn't include a single project of mine, or in fact, even another project of others. As I said, I've never given a talk within this particular frame. I've mentioned that to Daphne before too, but I'm very glad to have an opportunity to do so, especially given the fact that I have been studying very much within this field for quite some time as a principal concern of mine. I will also like to say that I will say the word "we" a lot in my talk, and the "we" I predominantly refer to is a wealthy Western "we." We might just say a "we" from the wealthy countries. I thought I might just put that out there initially now, so it can be taken into consideration. I'll also say that you're not going to like this talk at all. This is going to be one of the hardest talks I've probably given in a while, and I imagine you'll see why. One of the reasons I say this is I would like to cast an eye away from a strictly dystopia-utopia diametric and start to look more, shall we say, at the ground level as to the predicament we might find ourselves in on a planetary scale. I would like to frame a lot of the introduction, at least, within this beautiful quote here. The author, unfortunately, is unknown. It's an unattributed quote. It just came up in a Twitter thread, of which I was the grandparent. But we're always preparing for the apocalypse that we want. And I think that is certainly quite important, given humanities and arts conferences that might look at, for instance, where we're heading, the future casting. However, what I do see in many of these conferences, some of which I've attended or I've looked at streams or even reading literature on the topic, I will typically see that it's preparation for a desirable apocalypse. For instance, we might find the techno-panopticon, which we're arguably living in quite presently, is very much the sort of the new kid on the block, but nonetheless certainly very much the favourite at the moment. Black Mirror, of course, has propelled that to practically being a dinner table conversation, largely by way of the Netflix franchise. We also have the robot AI apocalypse, or the singularity, as it is less colloquially known. The singularity, one might see it as still existing entirely within the imaginary, even though there is very much a sense of a toward. Nonetheless, it does reside or preside in the imaginary, but in doing so, it is, I would say, given far too much focus, given the predicament. This is the very idea of a robot takeover is in fact relatively old in European culture. This is a Czech director, Remo Bufano, that in 1920 made a theatre piece of the robots actually revolting. Not that robots are revolting, but they were taking over, if you like. There was mutiny among the robots, the robot workforce. More recently, again, in Black Mirror, there was that wonderful episode, Metalhead, where we had these big dog-like robots hunting people in the hills. That needs no explanation. Blade Runner, of course, of which, this movie is relatively awful, but the original was very important to me as a kid. I was preparing for that robot apocalypse as a boy growing up in New Zealand, listening to my father's electronic music collection and experimental music collection, watching Blade Runner and reading sci-fi, this was the apocalypse that I was preparing for, and I kind of needed it to happen, and it doesn't, by any stretch of the imagination, look like we'll even get close. While techno-apocalyptic narratives seek to visualize the unimaginable, they are themselves innately comfortable. The very means of societal annihilation as products of human endeavor are already familiar and prescribed. Representations of AI robot apocalypse scenarios in popular culture are predominantly feel-good, I would argue, Frankensteinian fables, in that they depict us resilient and resolute as we face the fearsome products of our genius, fighting to save the species with all that we have left, our uniquely human cunning. And this is really, I think, essential to the distribution of these stories. Of these sort of future casting, is that we will be resilient against our own genius. But then this guy, Christopher Schmidt, said a relatively interesting thing that I read recently. While the world goes to waste for future generations, we distract ourselves from disaster by watching it as entertainment on a lit screen in a darkened amphitheatre. In truth, we are hiding in our stories. Formally speaking, the utopias, however, on the other side of the proverbial coin, act as a beacon of aspiration toward a better world. In this age of anxiety, however, they double as a comforting illusion of progress, a destination, a way out. This did extraordinarily well on the net. There was a call for renderings, if you like, of a future Paris, of a smart Paris, and this is Calibo with his buildings with funny tops on heritage protected buildings. I mean, I wonder how one would even get the permits to do such a thing. But people went wild for it, you know. I mean, we just sort of greenify Paris, and suddenly we've neutralized our carbon footprint, and this is the way of the future. I mean, it's a lovely vector, it's a lovely direction as a whole. I mean, things get pretty nuts, as you can see there. I hope those are all evergreen trees. And here's a mix of sort of hydro and wind. I mean, all beautiful stuff. Again, you know, there is this sense of a moving toward. But I would argue that utopia, we could see it as an advanced procrastination in a time of planetary crisis. And what do I mean by planetary crisis? Well, it's just getting too late for these bedtime stories, for these feel-good stories. Because climate change and, unfortunately, mass extinction are already well upon us. If we are going to have a realistic conversation about the future and where we're going, we do need to, unfortunately, address the rather uncomfortable, not feel-good realities of the predicament that we're in, something that I study at length these last years. It does take courage and clarity to accept that based on the best available understanding of our shared planetary predicament, everything probably is not going to be okay. As Noam Chomsky recently said, this is the first time in the history of the human species that we have to make decisions which will determine whether there will be decent survival for our grandchildren, and that's never happened before. Now, Noam Chomsky is relatively old, and when he says grandchildren, I guess he actually means his grandchildren, because we're already here. Where are we now? Well, this is a tweet that I saw the other day. It's kind of funny. Knock, knock, who's there? Is it climate change? Is that you? No, I'm already here. And this is a person responding to the evident reality that multi-year sea ice in the Arctic is essentially gone. Now, it's difficult to describe the seriousness of that. You might remember on 25th of February, or just that whole week, the actual Arctic was, this is in winter of course, was warmer than all of Europe. It was warmer in the Arctic. I mean, ocean currents are already starting to shift. We have air temperature ranked by month here. You can really see it. It's the spherical spaceship, if you like, that we're on is undergoing a significant change. We have in the Paris Agreement, we have people, hooray, you know, celebrating the big win of an agreement. But in truth, we're actually heading for around 3 degrees of warming. If all of the this is really interesting research. A paper came out relatively recently. If we are to, if all of the world's countries are to agree and stick to their agreements, the Paris agreements, we will nonetheless already hit around 3 degrees of warming, and that's going to be probably around 2050 or 2060. Now, 3 degrees of warming has a significant impact on the way we understand the planet. All the maps will need to be redrawn. Shanghai will officially be underwater. Miami will disappear. Rio de Janeiro will be partially submerged, and many cities that we're used to visiting will no longer exist in their current form. If all of the countries don't, or at least the majority of them, do not commit to the agreement, then we're looking at sort of 4 or 5 degrees of warming, which is effectively, I don't know, that's another thing. But from the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, made up of a very large number of biologists and scientists, their forecast is that within 30 years from now, an estimated 4 billion people, which is about 40% of the population, will live in arid or semi-arid areas with absolutely infertile ground, very low agricultural productivity. Italian wine is expected to go extinct in that period, the next 30 years, and Spanish wine will be certainly on the way up, but Norwegian Cabernet Cab Sav should be looking pretty good. We should be able to get pretty nice wine out of Norway. Maybe Germans will actually start making good red wine. I live in Berlin. That's the paper on the future of the wine industry. Even while we talk about utopias and dystopias in a popular cultural sense, there's a tremendous glut of delusion, or at least illusion, in the common conversations about our planetary predicament, about climate change. The reverse climate change delusion is certainly one of them. It is, unless we misunderstand the principal laws of physics and thermodynamics itself, that it's not possible to reverse climate change. Even if you can bring the temperature down, you can't reverse it. It's a little bit like saying to someone who has suffered a significant trauma or event in their life to sort of roll back to the self that they were before the trauma happened. Too late, they've already adapted, they've already changed. They've effectively become someone else, or at least in part. Everything's not just going to roll back if we manage to drop those degrees back down. The Earth will take a very different shape. There's also the technology will save us delusion, which is relatively endemic. Probably the biggest character within the technology will save us delusion is this negative emissions technologies, NET, which featured prolifically through the Paris Agreement resolution, through those texts. NETs are a means supposedly of sucking carbon out of the air, out of the atmosphere, and then burying it, saying in the Mariana Trench, the deepest part of the ocean, a couple of kilometres down, or just burying it underground again. So you're literally taking that carbon and pushing it back under the soil, such that it cannot do any harm. But the thing is that there's actually only one demonstration plant of NETs in existence, and it functions relatively poorly. Part of the Paris Agreements was all a commitment to rolling out these technologies, but they exist otherwise entirely within a theoretical framing. I mean, they don't actually exist in the world. And 29 European national science academies, that's a lot of people and a lot of minds have said the report finds that none of the nets mentioned in the panel on climate change models can be deployed fast enough or can remove the gigatons of carbon that would be necessary. Moreover, the authors find the large-scale deployments of nets would result in very high economic costs. So there's a macroeconomic discouragement there, and likely major impacts on terrestrial or marine ecosystems. Another guy said a really interesting thing that relates very much to the trouble with utopias, if you like, or at least utopic thinking as regards finding our way out of this. In this particular piece, this is a comment by a journalist in review of this particular report in a scientific journal. Nobody knows if atmospheric carbon removal, known as negative emissions, will work, and it could delay critical cuts to emissions while tacitly giving people the license to pollute. So that's a storytelling challenge right there. The other one we have afoot that doesn't get anywhere near the press it needs is the sixth extinction. the last of which was 65 million years ago. Elizabeth Kolber wrote a brilliant book on this very topic, The Sixth Extinction, and she got a Pulitzer Prize for it, and it certainly did the rounds within intelligentsia and those that might read that sort of thing. In it, she discusses the biosphere collapse, the loss of species at what is very much an alarming rate. But that was just prior to it being sort of considered a scientific consensus, or at least made official within the scientific reality, until this paper came out in 2015. Accelerated modern human-induced species losses entering the sixth mass extinction. What is this? The sixth extinction. I mean, what are we talking about? Well, here happens to be the official symbol of the mass extinction that it would appear we are very much in the midst of right now. The circle represents the Earth, and this represents the hourglass of time running out. E.O. Wilson, he practically coined biodiversity. He described the synergetic, intrinsic relationships between different organisms on the sphere that we live in, and very much is understood to be the father of biodiversity. He has his own number, which is actually considered relatively conservative, of us losing 27,000 species per year currently, which is about 1 every 19 minutes. The UN, United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, says that it's actually double his estimate, rendering his a bit conservative. Every day up to 150 species are lost. And we might think, well, that does sound a bit like a lot, but to put it in context, right back into the last 65 million years, the average background extinction rate has been 1 to 5 species a year. The Earth is literally growing quiet. Global populations of fish, birds, mammals, amphibians, and reptiles declined by 58% between 1970 and 2012. Like, that's where we're at, you know. And very, very disturbingly, recently in 2017, it has been emphatically proven that there's more than a 75% decline in just 27 years in flying insects, right? And that was in protected areas. So these were special areas where there's a sufficient amount of foliage and flowering foliage for insects to hang out in, not just these monocrops that you see when you're flying over Europe. And it's understood that Switzerland is in the same situation, France is in the same situation. In fact, all of Europe is in the same situation, if not worse. Another 10 years, and we are looking at the potential of core crop failure, bees and a certain 2 different classes of moths, and it's looking kind of grim. This is an excellent article that you might want to read on this very topic. Where have all the insects gone? Now, birds eat insects, so it's no wonder that the birds start to disappear too. And at the moment, there's 1,500 species approximately of birds that are on the brink of extinction globally. Bird populations across the French countryside have fallen by 1/3 over the last decade and a half. When you're looking at species disappearing and anthropogenic impacts as a whole, you can really look at sharks. Sharks have survived 420 million years old as a species, as a taxa. They've survived 5 extinctions, which is, they're amazing sharks. They're referred to often as the architects of the ocean, and that the only reason that fish actually school, like swim together, or develop, like marine animals developing camouflage techniques and strategies, is due to sharks. Take sharks out of the ocean, and they really do somewhat, the oceans fall out of balance. Just for instance, this is the number of sharks killed per hour, more or less, and that's how many people die per year. You can think of them as a keystone species. As extinction spreads, some of the lost forms prove to be keystone species. This is E.O. Wilson again, whose disappearance brings down other species and triggers a ripple effect. The loss of a keystone species is like a drill accidentally striking a power line that causes the lights to go out all over. And why does that matter? Well, natural products and the derivatives represent more than 50% of all the drugs in clinical use in the world. There is, for instance, leukemia. To fight back leukemia, particularly in children, from returning, all of that's the drug that really ensures that doesn't occur is based in the tropical forests of Madagascar, which are currently being certainly devastated. But 3/4 of the world's food comes from just 12 crops and 5 animal species. Chips and chocolate and coffee. Julian, but this is all really depressing. What about hope? You're a horrible public speaker. I understand if you are saying that in your head. As I said, this is not a talk I would normally give, but given the context, I'm taking the opportunity, selfishly. If the weatherman is to say, however, that a hurricane is coming, or a tidal wave, we don't go, oh, weatherman, don't be so negative, What about hope? We would respond. That's where we need to get to with this stuff. And as artists and designers, we need to take this on as very much a foreground challenge. The very excellent Kate Marvel, I'll talk about her in a bit, but just skip to the slide that I shouldn't have. Anyway, this is Derek Jensen. He's an environmental activist and he studies environments as well, ecosystems. He's a pretty sharp guy. He says, frankly, I don't have much hope. And this is an excellent paper, Beyond Hope, in Orion magazine, but I think it's a good thing. Hope is what keeps us chained to the system, the conglomerate of people and ideas and ideals that is causing the destruction of this planet. To start with, there's the false hope that suddenly, somehow, the system may inexplicably change, or that technology will save us. All of these false hopes lead to inaction, or at least ineffectiveness. And that's an important thing to state, I think. Kate Marvel, a climate scientist, she's a theoretical physicist. She's extraordinarily well-studied and well-read, and is a central voice in understanding our climate predicament. Said in this excellent article, I have no hope that these changes can be reversed. We are inevitably sending our children to live on an unfamiliar planet. But the opposite of hope is not despair, it is grief. Even while resolving to limit the damage, we can mourn. In fact, we need courage, not hope. Grief, after all, is the cost of being alive. We're all fated to live lives shot through with sadness and are not worth any less for it. Courage is the resolve to do well without the assurance of a happy ending. And that's the kind of reality check I think that many of us need to have as we imagine ourselves sort of going forward. But damage minimization as a thing, as an idea, as an object of thought, has a charisma problem. It has none of the allure of additive, techno-solutionist, if you like, or fix-it market mechanisms. Then we have the sort of selective myths of futility that you'll often encounter in a drunken dinner table chat about the state of the planet. We have this, we're fucked anyway, live large, go out with a bang. I'll have a smile on my dial as I pop the cork, as the asteroid rolls in or whatever. But it won't play out like that. We have this sort of apocalyptic framing where it's difficult to have conversations with people about the state of the planet without immediately being cast into an apocalyptic light. But we're not facing the apocalypse, we're facing big change. Then there's the sort of nothing I can do can make a difference. I mean, real change only ever happens from above. It's an imposed thing. And this is a kind of deferral to authority that we also need to get over and build stories, if you like, or ways of thinking about this that help us escape that. And truth would rather be changed than change ourselves. Then there was this incredible paper, document, that surfaced last year. It's written by 15,364 scientists from 184 countries. That's more scientists that have ever, in all of human history and scientific history, ever signed a single document. And they're just literally screaming, what we need to do and where we're at. As most political leaders respond to pressure, scientists, media influencers and lay citizens must insist that their governments take immediate action as a moral imperative to current and future generations of human and other life. With the groundswell of organised grassroots efforts, dogged opposition can be overcome and political leaders compelled to do the right thing. But it's also time to re-examine and change our individual behaviours, including limiting our own reproduction, ideally to replacement level at most, and drastically diminishing our per capita consumption of fossil fuels, meat and other resources. That's pretty damn clear. Fossil fuels, meat, and other resources. So let's unpack that for a bit. Well, for one thing, it's widely known that animal agriculture is responsible for the most loss of habitat, or at least rate by rate, on this planet. It's last year the WWF found that 60% of all global biodiversity, in fact, which is really the mechanism or machine of extinction, the loss of habitats, is down to meat-based diets, which put a huge strain, as this article says, on Earth's resources. This is the number of animals killed a second to feed that worldwide. This is an excellent book called The Handbook of Tyranny. It's a fantastic book. This, for instance, you can look at pig distribution in Europe. You see there's 100 to 250 pigs per square kilometre just with that colour. What we've actually done is we've replaced the wild with livestock. This is from an excellent book called Harvesting the Biosphere at MIT Press. This is just a simple, visual understanding of the proportions of change. We've just swapped out the wild with the animals that we effectively eat and whose breast milk we drink. Crop and grazing lands now cover more than a third of Earth's entire land surface, making livestock the largest user of land resources on Earth. Here's my little infrastructural transparency dinner party cheat sheet. As someone who's been speaking about communications infrastructure for years in a critical engineering frame, I find myself often sort of on the wrong foot here myself. So energy is cool. You can talk about energy infrastructure. That's cool. Water is definitely cool now. You couldn't really talk about water before. It was like, whatever, there's always going to be water. And then, the economy, yes, very much so. We need to get to the bottom of this. Communications, oh, top cool. That's extra cool. But food system, you bloody hippies, who invited you anyway? Stop rubbing it in our faces. Soy is a real topic here. Soy, we like to think that those bloody vegetarians and vegans are ruining the Amazon, but in fact it's not the case. The average European consumes approximately 61 kgs of soy per year, largely indirectly through the animal products they eat, like chicken, pork, salmon, cheese, milk, and eggs. Feed crops are already produced in a large number of the Earth's most valuable and vulnerable areas: Amazon, Congo Basin, Yangtze, Mekong, etc. Here is, for instance, a soy crop going in the Amazon Basin. And here's another. You see the totally cool pics up there. Totally cool. Not. 36 football pitches a minute, supposedly. The average European, responsible for, say, the 61 kgs of soy per year, which is a tremendous amount of soy grain. I mean, your average vegan or vegetarian would only eat a small portion of that. It requires about 400 square metres of land per year to meet that need. Palm oil is another big one. Palm oil, many people haven't even heard of this thing called palm oil. But palm oil is a major driver of deforestation, of habitat loss worldwide, and therefore extinction. This is Borneo, captured by NASA's Earth Observatory, of fires burning in Borneo just to clear land cover to grow this palm oil. And you think, what the funk is palm oil? I mean, what is this stuff? What's it talking about? Well, here's what it looks like on the ground anyway, the deforestation process. Well, palm oil is, this is Kalimantan on the Indonesian side of Borneo. Greenpeace discovered this by drone the other day. It's half the size of Paris, and it's just happened. Palm oil is in all this stuff that we buy. In fact, it's in about half the stuff in the supermarket. It's in lipstick, soap, pizza dough, instant noodles, shampoo, detergent. It's this silent material in the background of our lives. It's in toothpaste that is literally burning the proverbial library of life. There's pharmaceuticals that would otherwise potentially be discovered that could certainly improve our lives significantly. I mean, species are being discovered as they're being wiped out. There's some alternate names for palm oil. In truth, we can't have the world and eat it too. What if our smoothest path through all this has less to do with invention than doing less of certain things? There's a doctor-doctor metaphor. I mean, if we are to go to the doctor and the doctor says you need to stop doing that thing or you're going to get sick, we would understand very directly that we need to respond this to the doctor's suggestions, but we don't apply that necessarily to the planet. There's the other population narrative of which has this kind of scope bias or scale bias, where we think that there's just too many people. Fossil fuels, we certainly are literally. We all have our footprint, but it's not evenly distributed. Switzerland, for instance, there's a 4.31 metric or measure compared to the USA, for instance, of 16.59. So you could say that there's 4 Swiss people can fit into 1 American, you could say, on the carbon footprint level, which is good. I mean, Switzerland's doing really well. There's also food shortage. I'm going to finish soon. A caloric maldistribution. You could talk about it like this. In this excellent paper, which actually was co-authored by the Institute of Molecular Systems Biology in Zurich, concurrently replacing, it's quite an amazing research, all animal-based items in the US diet with plant-based alternatives will add enough food to feed in full 350 million additional people, well above the expected benefits of eliminating all supply chain food waste, which is incredible. Little people know, or few people know, that the livestock industry is responsible for more emissions than all transport. It's the second largest contributor to climate change. So this is why I took the train. I mean, I'm doing my little bit. I suppose I have a terrible carbon footprint in my history, having flown so much. So just simply flying to fro Berlin, Geneva is 121 kilos. So just to sort of finish up, I would just like to end on a slightly uplifting note before Tobias actually really raises the floor and gets things moving. I love you, Tobias. Art design, our cultures of storytelling can play a central role in propagating a new planetary subjectivity to instill a rich topological and infrastructural understanding as to how our chains of production and supply interact with both our biosphere and climate. A future less barren, less hungry and hard requires we learn to work with, not against, the planet upon which our existence entirely depends. After all, we've got absolutely nowhere else to go. Thanks a lot. Cheers. Thanks. Told you. Told you it would be.
Right, I'm going to try and be a bit quicker. Thanks, Julian. Unbelievable. So in the context of this discussion about utopia and dystopia, I'm interested very much in how we visualize and model notions of utopia and dystopia and then try and project them back onto the surface of the planet. The image, of course, is from, and I'm going to bring up some of the stuff Julian talked about, actually, so there's a good link. The image, of course, is from Star Trek. Will Riker is wandering out into the holodeck, and it alludes to an idea that Catherine Hales came up with, which is called the holodeck paradox, which is essentially that if you had the technology that allowed you to accurately and totally simulate reality, why would you do anything else? Like, why would you bother doing Star Trek stuff, like going to planets? Because you can now live out any form of fantasy. And my particular fascination with computer-generated imagery and software and the kind of infrastructures that create them indicate an aspiration, in sort of nascent aspiration in humans for this. Like the push for AR, VR, pervasive media is this kind of nascent aspiration for like enclosed digital fantasies. And they're very hard to question because they're so rich. So I kind of want to talk about that a bit, basically, and some strategies of how to question them. So in The Arrival, the film, the adaptation of Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang, we're introduced to the idea of linguistic relativity, otherwise known as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And in this theory, the language that you speak and also think in constructs your worldview, right? So the semantics and structure of the language you speak in constructs how you relate to reality in the universe, and that's something that's pretty well accepted. And what this predicates to us is that language is a form of technology. Stephen Connor in Dream Machines, which I'd highly recommend, ends it with the idea that there is no way of framing ethical, political, and philosophical questions that would not also have to be a matter of technique, or technesis, and so would not have to be imagined mechanically. So if we take the idea of linguistic relativity, that we have a technology called language that we use to structure meaning and build a worldview, and we add it to the fact that our entire sense of self is a mechanical one, is a technological one, we try and technologize everything. And a great example of this is, of course, in our nature-culture battle, which has been alluded to a few times already. So the early history of scientific atlases is a particularly interesting insight into the struggle of modern Europeans to technologize the mess of nature. Lorraine Gaston has an amazing book called Objectivity, which is all about this idea. And she talks about a thing called the truth to nature objectivity, which was an idea held in kind by scientists and artists who illustrated these atlases, that nature was imperfect, and there was like a perfection of all the specimens of nature underlying the messiness of nature. So you would have these beautiful illustrations of certain species of plants, but they're not real plants. This specimen of Diavilla never existed. It's an idealized version of a collection of specimens that was gathered and then rendered to be the most perfect version, a kind of fantasy version. And so we classified nature, we gave names to species, we taxonomized them, we find their archetype, which we then impress on the world and say this is the most perfect species, all others, or the most perfect individual of a species, all others are imperfect. And so we say to nature, well, you're chaotic and you're wrong, so we're gonna make you better, and we're gonna make you more efficient. But of course, the efficiency is, again, as Stephen Connor alludes to, it's imagined mechanically. We put mechanical values. So James C. Scott in Seeing Like a State talks about the project of German forestry science. So when Germany was a kind of burgeoning industrial concern in the 1870s, one of their major exports was lumber. But it was very hard to kind of measure the amount of lumber that was being produced and therefore optimize it, because the forests generally, look like they do on the left. They're messy, they're difficult to read, they're illegible to the mechanical mind. And so German forestry scientists developed ways of rearranging and maximizing the productivity of forests, arranging the trees in orderly rows, giving them the perfect amount of space to grow and develop, and so on and so forth. Of course, after 4 or 5 yields, this completely fails, because the lack of biodiversity in the forest means that the soil is completely barren and nothing can grow there anymore. But the complexity is illegible to humans. Nature has failed. You're not good enough. We need to perfect you and make you better. We have made a render, a model, a spreadsheet where the forest can behave better, and we're going to reshape the world in that image. As he puts it, the utopian, imminent, and continually frustrated goal of the modern state is to reduce the chaotic, disorderly, constantly changing social reality beneath it to something more closely resembling the administrative grid of its observations. So in the render, in the model, it works, therefore we apply it back to the real world, and that will make it better. This festival is called Mapping Festival, but very few people talk about maps. This has confused me somewhat, but never mind. So maps, of course, are a great source of this reductionism of the world into a model where the priorities that are important are drawn out. And in certainly the main history of maps we have now, the priority is movement, because people who created maps were generally states or powerful individuals who had goods and troops to move around. And so early maps like Puttinger's Tabula, which is a 13th century copy of a map from sort of 40-ish AD, show mainly obstacles to movement like mountains and sea and rivers, as well as roads and roads that connect things. And roads then become this kind of de facto priority for what we look for in the surface of the earth, the ability to move things across it. And we still have that today in fiber optic cables and things like that. It's interesting to speculate, if we didn't prioritize movement as our abstraction of the world, would we have developed the car? Because we wouldn't have had to build roads. We might have ended up with something different. If we look at alternative or speculate on alternative histories of maps, you could start with something like Micronesian stick charts, which don't map human movement, but map the movement of water. So these map the movement of currents and wave fronts. So they don't tell you anything about how humans can optimally move through the space. They tell you about how water can optimally move through the space, and therefore how humans can use that. And then this visualization of mapping the surface of the earth and constructing roads and blah, 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 sort of continues. The most extreme example of this is probably the Haussmannization of Paris, which took place between the late 18th century and mid-19th century, where there was a kind of master plan by Haussmann of fixing Paris by redesigning it, redistricting it, making these super wide boulevards and avenues that cut through the middle of it. You know, a lot of that was about preventing the spread of cholera, things like that, getting rid of a lot of the slums that were very unhealthy. But a lot of it was also about militarizing the city. I mean, critics then and now point out that the major avenues connect barracks and military bases with major government buildings, that they're too wide to barricade, essentially. In the time that Haussmann was doing this, Paris had 7 armed uprisings. So they got very paranoid about making sure that Paris could not be seized by militias or by communards ever again, by making these very wide boulevards, and they can easily move troops down and things like that. And this is kind of the beginning of the designer, and you know, here's where the critique of design comes. The designer is like the demiurge who has the power over social control, that the design of the perfect system will be able to give us the utopia, the perfect society. This is a sort of critical painting of that notion and that dream of sort of recreating the glory, the fictional utopia of the glorious Roman Empire that many of these master planners had in the 19th century. And even 100 years after that point, Paris was still this site that was in need of great fixing. Le Corbusier's Radiant City was a plan to sort of, again, bulldoze huge amounts of Paris and replace it with these modernist blocks. And like a lot of modernists, Le Corbusier was seized by the idea that the car would be the great liberator, right? It's that everybody just had a car and we had roads that connected everybody everywhere. Then a bit like how Facebook talks about community, this kind of abstract notion of having a car would make everything better somehow. His plans didn't play off, but that notion that humans are a problem that need to be designed out kind of continues today in things like human-centered design, which is this notion that humans are a problem that need to be fixed. And so the vision of the designer and the architect and the master planner as someone who can bring us this utopia is kind of everywhere today in a way that it wasn't 100 years ago. Certainly in London, I haven't seen it so much here, but in London now, you know, there's as much images of fake city as there is images of real city. You know, on my commute from my flat to my work, about a third of my journey is just going past 8-foot-high hoardings with these kind of renderings and banal catchphrases on that tell me about the luxury blocks that are going to be here in probably about 6 months' time, because the pace of this stuff is astronomical. Crystal Benz has got a brilliant blog where she documents sort of the aesthetics of development hoardings that's well worth checking out. They're very similar, they're very much the same, and there's a reason for that, is that because these are industrially produced future visions. They're not future visions that are bespoke to each developer, they're not kind of like really custom. You know, we can criticize Le Corbusier, but at least his work was situated. He was very much dealing with Paris. He was thinking about what I can do for the French people in Paris, whereas the work of these guys is drag and drop utopias. They can be done anywhere. So if you look at a rendering of a development or an architectural, not necessarily all architectural images, but certainly the stuff that appears on hoarding, the chances are it was done by one of 3 main companies. Crystal CG is the biggest company in the world for doing architectural renderings. Chinese-based company. You take your architectural plan, you Dropbox it over to them, they produce this rendering and send it back to you, and you put it on your advertising hoardings. And that's the reason they all look the same, because they're literally done by the same people who have a sort of grab bag of default tools that they run them through and produce these images. And then these images that populate the city form our relationship with the stuff that Julian was alluding to, the more speculative science fiction stuff of what the future city is. I'm a complete masochist, so I've DuckDuckGo'd Future City here, and you end up with these images that could be anywhere. There's no situatedness to them, there's no site specificity. They kind of torture and limit the imagination of what the future could be, this relationship between the renderings produced by developers and the ones that end up in science fiction and re-inform the developers over and over again about what we want. So Alfred Gell refers to this strategy of convincing us of a social reality through a vision or a technology as a technology of enchantment, which he says are technical strategies that exploit innate or derived psychological biases so as to enchant the other person and cause him or her to perceive social reality in a way that is favorable to the social interests of the enchanter. So we become enchanted by these visions. We become convinced of their totality, the thing that, some of the stuff that Julian was alluding to, if someone else will fix it, or this is someone else's thing. And that's an effect of these powerful images that are everywhere and pervasive and kind of dominate the the world. And so I'm interested very quickly, I'm trying to rush through this as quickly as I can, in the tactics and strategies we can use for taking that technology and turning it to other purposes, or at least talking a bit more about the origins of that technology and where it works. So working with CGI, whether doing utopias or dystopias, is kind of equally as unhelpful. CGI has made it remarkably easy to begin to visualize things that otherwise were the realm of kind of literature, because they can now be kind of built on sound stages quite quickly and cheaply. Hunger Games is a good example, Black Mirror is another example of things that were difficult to do in the media before because they required too much production, can now easily be done. But like I say, it's just as unhelpful sending people dystopias as utopias, because it's just telling them something abstract to fear instead of something abstract to wish for. More importantly than film, actually, is video games. Video games are the world's biggest media form. They're bigger than movies. They're bigger than anything else. They're bigger than music. GTA 5, Grand Theft Auto 5, is the highest grossing media product of all time. We need to pay much more attention to video games. There are critical people doing video games, but in a few years they will be in the same remit as films are now. But video game technology, video games are often used as a site of social critique as well. So Far Cry 5, that was released recently, was a kind of a sort of a micro dystopia based in the US, and it was kind of critiquing the US's sort of evangelical, gun-focused obsession of recent times. But again, it was basically you run through it, living out the fantasy of killing all the bad guys and then saving and going and eating dinner and coming back later. So it's not helpful. But there's a radical otherness in this technology which opens up new possibilities. A little bit about what was talked about this morning about imagining new ontologies for technology. The radical otherness of computation creates profound opportunities for change. And I'm not going to go through loads of practices, but there's lots of interesting practices out there that are starting to explore CGI's potential. Zeitgeist do this quite kind of friendly, candy-like imagery that plays with physics and material rendering platforms to see what's possible, do things that would never otherwise be possible under normal physical conditions of living on the surface of the Earth. They mostly do this for advertising and brands, but I think it indicates an aesthetic shift that's important. On a more artistic front, the work of people like Sasha Poflep and Chris Vobkin, who've been exploring sort of open source rendering platforms to try and figure out their physics engines, so liquid simulations, gas simulations, things that when you can tweak the physics of the world in a piece of software, that has quite remarkable possibilities for what you know about the physics of the world. And so they sort of played with this in various pieces of work where they looked at the algorithms that dictate, for instance, how does an object fall, right? How has that been decided? What science has gone into deciding the rate of the fall and then collapsing of an object? And is that modelable in any way? And then there's lots of critical work around CGI technology itself, so things like Nikita Dakour, who creates these, what he calls the digital grotesque, these kind of like renderings that appear to be quite cartoonish, but in fact explore the construction of the software and the physics that go into it and sort of leave it on a knife edge of being kind of cartoony, but also then breaking apart the engine itself and revealing how the thing is made. And finally, most recently, I haven't fully fleshed this out yet, but I'm completely and utterly fascinated by speedrunning in video games. I've been writing a lot about it, and no one's been reading it. No. I talk to my friends about it a lot, and they're just like, I don't care. It's really fascinating. So speedrunning is a sort of gaming subculture, but it's really huge. Good speedrunning videos get millions of views. And the aim of speedrunning is to complete a game as fast as possible, to go from the start to the end as fast as possible. This is the record that was held in February for Dark Souls 3, and any % run means you don't have to complete everything in the game, you just have to get to the end. The remarkable thing about these speedrunners is when we talk about playing games, what we generally actually mean is following the rules that were laid out for us by the developers. We really mean completing the narrative, right? You're just playing it from the beginning to the end. You're not actually playing with it in the sense of testing the rules of the architecture that constructs the thing. So what speedrunners do is they exploit glitches, loopholes, frame drops, all sorts of techniques that are baked into not only the software but also the hardware of the machines they're playing on in order to achieve faster and faster runs. In this particular instance, Watchdog has exploited a glitch whereby you can turn yourself into this flame, which temporarily, for about 2 frames, gives your character a sort of a base of 0, which means you can drop through the game and clip through the scenery to get to the end faster. But that doesn't come from like playing really well. That doesn't come from being really good at Dark Souls. That comes from having a nuanced and rich and sophisticated understanding of how the world you exist in is built and what makes it operate, and then thousands and thousands of hours of experimentation and fluff testing and things like that. And I think there's something in this that's a strategy for like breaking through the technologies of rendering and visualization we have and playing them with them properly in the way that perhaps the Italian autonomists did with bureaucracy in the 60s, that for me is quite exciting and perhaps needs exploring a little more. Thanks very much.
All right, thanks a lot, Julian and Tobias. Well, the presentations were a little bit longer, so yeah, so we don't have so much time. I will try to maybe summarize a few of my thoughts, raise one question, and then also leave some time for you, the audience, to ask a question. I think I found very interesting the fact that somehow there was a statement within your statements, and this is the fact that you both, in a way, decided while we're addressing this question of utopias and dystopians to not talk about your own work, but rather, bring in your arguments about what is the issue, the problem with these questions nowadays. I think there is, there is in a way I don't know if I should call it a call for action, especially in Julian's talk for sure, but also in you, Tobias, when you talked about unrendering. I really find very interesting this focus of the known agency that is found in hope that Julian mentioned, and in Tobias how we can turn to other tactics and how we can, in a way, unrender the future. But somehow, because in your practice, you have dealt a lot in the past with issues that have to do with black boxing, with issues that have to do with how we communicate knowledge. I was wondering, while it seems like we are in an impasse right now, what would you bring in from them, if you would bring in something, in order to address this kind of environmental, political kind of moment that we're in right now? How would you, especially you, Julian, but also Tobias, what would you say about that?
Well, I would say that, I mean, I've spent years studying network infrastructure and communications infrastructure such that we can find new ways of, or at least new mobilities in those spaces for the perspective of being able to build new futures for ourselves. But you know, the more I study systems, I find myself, particularly as regards infrastructure, I find myself, all rivers run to the biggest of all infrastructures, if you like, without speaking too cybernetically, I suppose, of the configuring the world as a resource, which is very much its own problem. Fish stocks, you know, et cetera, freshwater reserves. The language of James C. Scott, you know, his texts on this are certainly very revealing. But anyway, the more I study this stuff, whole planet infrastructure, awareness, or at least not only awareness but also subjectivity, literacy, are sorely lacking. They're sorely lacking in the arts and humanities, in the tech arts scene, even in the Hackteria and biological or bioart scene. There is not enough of an eye cast to the fact that we are currently on a sphere hurtling through space, you know, with a very thin atmosphere, and we do have a little limited time. I mean, all that we're fighting for and all our battles are somewhat lost in the next 30 or 40 years unless we can really start to make a difference there. And so, I think that we can draw from a broader history, or at least a conversation around infrastructural transparency and infrastructural subjectivity and mobility, but start to apply it up to, or scale it up to the food system, and start to scale it up to our energetic interactions, whether that be from fossil fuels or from renewable energies, et cetera, so that we can, at least to be speaking with not only a sense of realism but also a sense of scope, and very much in time with what the scientists have been, of late, especially the last few years, have been screaming at us about. It's time to really take notice. Yeah. Did I talk for another half an hour then, Daphne? No.
Yeah, thanks. Another thing that I would like to mention, and connecting both of your talks, is that you specified, Julian, in the very beginning what the we is that you are kind of bringing in. And I might have a small kind of objection here regarding to how much we have dismissed totally dystopias and utopias specifically. Because there is a question here about whose dystopians and whose utopians we're talking about. And I think that this is something that we didn't have time to look into so much. But this is something that I believe that I would also like to ask Tobias, because you have worked a lot on speculative and critical design. And I found it very interesting that recently you said that basically the field failed. And which is kind of a daring kind of statement. And now we see in your recent writing and your work how you're kind of turning into a new direction, and how you are kind of bringing in issues that have to do with knowledge, but also with the imagination. And the black boxing that I mentioned before, again, in a way, it does come in. So, like of how we unpack and how we unrender. So I don't know if you would like to comment a bit on that.
Yeah, I've provocatively said that speculative design, which is held up in the design world as this kind of like the beacon of what design can do for the world, failed because it basically, like the whole field of design and architecture can't distance itself from the fact that it's based in preserving a European sense of liberal democracy. And that's all it has. So certainly in the last few years, speculative design, the canon of work became very much warning stories about how we might go off the rails and lose European liberal democracy, which of course excludes anyone who wants any other system. I mean, I don't care what fascists want, but like people who maybe have more radical views than that, or want to live in a more communitarian way or anything else, they're sort of tacitly excluded from the conversation in speculative design. And in fact, I was in a workshop with some pretty kind of dull but pretty kind of like well-established academics last week, and I by the end of it was just saying I don't think there can be a design that can live in the world of the things that Julian's talking about, live in a world of kind of a global ecology. We kept talking about ecology, but whenever I mentioned sort of the mining of cobalt and silicon, the faces just went blank. Because it was like, oh yeah, but the Internet of Things will fix that. It's like, yeah, but to do that, you need this stuff, and you create plastic that's going to be around for 40,000 years and things like that. And I think design, and even speculative and critical design, are so married to their lineage in industrial production and the work of Le Corbusier and things like that, that I don't think they can do it, which is why I just call myself an artist now, because that gives you a bit more levity to move in those spaces, even though I work in design and work with designers a lot. But also that's a provocation to design, to maybe do better. But also I have a real problem with the designer as the demiurge, the designer as the master craftsman, design thinking as this sort of virilytic pox that's infected business and government. Like these things as if the designer will fix it. We'll bring in the designer. Come, fix our problem. Designer lays out some post-it notes. Everyone goes home happy. It's perhaps too cynical. But yeah, essentially I don't think it can distance itself from its past without radical transformation. And just to finish up what Julian was saying, we're starting to see that a bit in the somewhat problematic fields of things like theories of things like object-oriented ontology and the accompanying things, which can be really, really bad, but also do begin to introduce a techno worldview that decenters the human, that gets over the human-centered design aspect and puts us in a greater cosmic nexus of things. Do you hate design?
We have time for one or two questions, Carmen? Yeah? Any questions, comments? Somebody would like to address something? No. Or you go. Go ahead. What's Rachel?
I haven't put the question together in my head yet. Sorry. It was kind of to do with a point Julian made actually towards the end of your talk, when you were saying you're kind of pushing again back against this idea that people maybe divest themselves of individual responsibility because they feel like they can't really make a difference. I heard a criticism kind of the other way around though, where it's like you have obviously kind of a very neoliberal state kind of pushing back on individuals to make very, very small changes that actually maybe aren't that significant, where what we actually need to be doing is pushing for much broader policy changes. And I just wondered how you responded to that.
Yeah, well, I think one example, for instance, would be that the organic or biomarkets. And none of these were implemented from the top down. These were entirely consumer-driven, if you like, directives that shifted market vectors and created whole new supply chains. Literally had real impact on European, especially in Germany. It's absolutely tangible geographies. You know, we're farmlets, small farms. It also seeded the basis of an opposition to insecticides that are threatening the honeybees, or principal pollinators, that we absolutely depend upon in order to have food. I mean, with the exception of wind-pollinated crops like corn and wheat, all of the rest of it really depends on bees. And these were ground-up efforts to shift the market that have resulted in a direct customer market discursive agency, if you like, that has had a tremendously positive impact. Then on the other end of the scale, you've got, for instance, shark finning. I mean, 100 or something million sharks a year are killed. And for this shark fin soup stuff that people in China like to eat a lot. One very famous Chinese basketballer, after he retired, made it his mission to end shark finning, and he went out there rallying against shark finning, and it's been an 80% decline in a year and a half in shark finning. You know, I mean, it's we love to believe this idea of a certain kind of a powerlessness. And indeed, liberal and late capitalist machinery will work, and even statecraft can work against populations that are implementing their own change. But there is something to be said for a market-dictated change, and that can start with end users. Already, palm oil is starting to drop in usage, particularly from Malaysian suppliers. And believe it or not, red meat consumption, beef of which is the absolute worst for the environment, is dropping significantly in France, of all places, and no one ever imagined that, and it's just falling like this, you know, just simply because of campaigning and growing awareness. Anyway, and they're all good things for the planet.
Just quickly also, like, the market stresses thing is interesting. Like, there's a story that a mutual friend told us about the Singaporean government putting fines on any company that was registered in Singapore at all that had anything to do with palm oil, because the haze from the palm oil burning blows over into Singapore. So the market and then Singapore has to spend money on healthcare for all the people who end up getting ill from the haze. So there's a market imperative in that way. They're not, you know, I'm sure the Singaporean government is bothered about palm oil, but they weren't going to make such a massive policy change without the economic imperative of saying it's going to be much more economically viable for us to fine these companies and then pay for the healthcare while dissuading them from doing this or investing in this activity. So that becomes an economic imperative rather than an environmental imperative. And again, that you know, in this way of sophisticate, I think, you know, James C. Scott talks about it a lot, Alfred Gell talks about it a lot, loads of people do. You know, there's something about having a sophisticated and nuanced understanding of how a system of parts works together and exactly where to make a small tweak to have a ricochet down that system that can be more effective than going out protesting or starting a movement, because you hit the key performance indicators, you hit the health statistics and the legal cases, and those things affect big organizations more than protests.
Is there something, some other question or comment? Okay. Okay, then thanks a lot. Thank you for your talks. Thanks a lot for attending.